Lester, Wisher Engineer. One of my great interests, and something that features a lot on my channel, is the use of modern materials, technology and engineering to attempt to reinvent, improve, or otherwise change weapons, armor, and fighting techniques of the past. In terms of armor, modern materials provide a lot of avenues for investigation and potential improvement on what's come before. In Australia, wearable ballistic protection is actually classed as a weapon, and it is illegal to own any kind of wearable ballistic protection without a permit. I guess a certain series of historic events involving a certain individual will never be forgotten by the Australian Constabulary. However, there is no legal restriction to owning or wearing stab and cut-resistant armor, and I've thus investigated and tested several different types of modern stab and cut-resistant armor on my channel. In order to perform these investigations, I built and calibrated a test system comprising a free-swinging pendulum which has a knife mount on it, which weighs around 5 kilograms. Or it's weighted with a 5 kilogram weight, I should say. It weighs more than 5 kilograms, but the weight attached to it is 5 kilograms. Along with a free swinging sample mount to make the tests reasonably consistent in terms of energy and impact force. By allowing the pendulum knife mount to swing from specified angles, I can either increase or decrease the impact force and the energy behind the stabbing tests. So I'd encourage you to check out some of those other videos if you're interested in seeing these tests. As background to these tests, it is important to acknowledge the prevalence of knife-related crime and homicide. A 2011 report published on the Australian government website for the Australian Institute of Criminology, which is entitled Knife Crime: Recent Data on Carriage and Use by Lorana Bartels, has the following to say about knife-related homicide. The most recent UHMWPE report indicated that in 2007 to 2008, more homicide victims died from stab wounds than from any other single cause of death. The number of homicides involving knives had remained relatively unchanged since 1989 to 1990, although due to the decline in firearm homicides, knife-related homicides comprised a larger proportion of homicides recorded in the more recent data. In both 2006 to 2007 and 2007 to 2008, knives or sharp instruments were involved in 43% of homicides. By way of comparison, in 2000, knives and other sharp instruments accounted for only 30% of homicides. The vast majority of victims who died as a result of a stab wound in 2007 to 2008, 92%, were stabbed with a knife. Stab wounds were the most common cause of death in Victoria, where they accounted for 59% of homicides. They were least common in Tasmania, 20%, and the Australian Capital Territory, 0%. Although the smaller number of homicides in these jurisdictions, namely 5 and 3 respectively, should be acknowledged. Acquaintance homicides were particularly likely to be as a result of a stabbing, 52%, compared with 43% for domestic homicides and 20% for stranger homicides. So, as you can see from this excerpt, the threat of knife-related crime is still a persistent and real problem that could face anyone who hopes to defend themselves successfully from a criminal attack. In order to address this threat, a significant portion of our self-defense curriculum and other self-defense systems as well, a significant portion of this training is aimed at knife defense. However, it is important to acknowledge the deadly threat posed by a knife wielder and the extreme difficulty of dealing with that kind of threat. A knife, like most weapons, is a force multiplier. Put simply, a knife wielder need expend very little energy and effort in order to be lethal, when compared to even a very well-trained, unarmed defender. Even after years of consistent self-defense training, a knife wielder still retains the upper hand over a defender if the defender is unarmed. To add insult to injury, Australian law does not allow the carrying, typically, of any kind of weapon for self-defense purposes. Even less than lethal options such as pepper spray and taser type weapons cannot be owned or carried by the typical security conscious civilian in this country. Thus, carrying an actual weapon that could help to even the odds against a knife-wielding assailant is typically out of the question, making it relatively certain that a typical defender will be unarmed when facing a knife wielder. And this, of course, makes it very necessary to do self-defense training using unarmed techniques in order to deal with a knife-wielding assailant, as difficult as that may be. This also makes the kind of self-defense situation that potentially a defender could face a very desperate one for the defender. That's why the idea of light and easily wearable forms of stab and cut-resistant armor might be an attractive idea. There are many different types of cut-resistant clothing and armor that are advertised and commercially available, all claiming to be, to a greater or lesser extent, knife-proof. In previous videos, I've tested some of these options and shown them typically to be ineffective, particularly against stabbing attacks. These items of clothing and armor often incorporate high tensile strength fabrics, such as woven aramid and woven ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene, or UHMWPE for short. Oompa. Oompa, loompa, doopa-dee-dee. Bit of a mouthful. Cut resistance is not as difficult to achieve as some may think. In fact, even conventional thick and or layered clothing is fairly resistant to cutting. This is partially due to the fact that the cutting force is spread along a line along the blade's edge, instead of being concentrated into a small impact area, such as might be encountered in a stab. This accounts for the relatively large number of fatalities reported in knife attacks being as a result of stab wounds, which was noted in the report that I referenced earlier. The most lethal application of a knife is in a stab, rather than in cutting or slashing movements. And unfortunately, there are not many forms of easily wearable armor that can protect the wearer from being stabbed with a knife. The highly concentrated impact force can penetrate most flexible materials that would be used as soft body armor. So I was really interested when I saw a fabric shirt that claimed some level of stab resistance and that was lined with a type of ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene felt that I'd not seen or tested before. We ordered some of this felt material as soon as we could in order to perform some tests and confirm whether this was a game changer in terms of stab resistance. I was a little suspicious because although the product information indicated stab resistance, the standard that it referenced was a withdrawn European standard dealing with foot and leg protectors. I could not find a free copy of this standard, but it can safely be assumed that the kind of penetrating objects used in the testing process were not blades or knives, casting a shadow over the claim of stab resistance. After examining the material when we received it, I was cautiously optimistic that it would show improved stab resistance over typical woven high tensile strength fabrics. And I felt this because the fibers in this felt are actually multi-directional. They're all over the place, as opposed to the weave of a fabric in which the fibers run along fixed axes, fixed lines, and fixed angles. And these fixed lines or angles or axes can represent orientations that are weak to the stabbing plane of a knife blade as it enters. So if you can imagine this being the fabric and my fingers being the weave, if the blade enters at a particular angle or the fabric is twisted as it enters to accommodate the plane of the knife, the blade can pass between sets of fibers and just cut a single line of fibers that are interspersed between those, which is what is typical in a fabric. So these represent orientations that are weak to stabbing. So I was thus hopeful that the multi-directional fiber layout in this felt could act to improve the material's stab resistance. In addition, you probably won't be able to see it here, but this felt material is thicker than a typical fabric at approximately 2 millimeters thick, representing comparatively more layers of fibers that must be pierced in order to stab through this fabric, or this felt, I should say. I took some magnified video footage of some aramid cloth, like a Kevlar style cloth, some ultra high molecular weight polyethylene woven cloth, and of this ultra high molecular weight polyethylene felt, using my son's microscope, which has the feature to take little video clips at high magnifications. And this is what these fabrics look like up close. And you can clearly see the differences in the fiber arrangements. I then set up a series of tests using my pendulum test system. In this set of tests, I mounted the cold steel GI Tanto to the pendulum. As the name suggests, the GI Tanto has a Tanto style point. For reference, I'll put the approximate impact forces and energies associated with the pendulum angle in an inset table. And this is what the first set of tests looked like.
Only a very slight penetration. Very, very, very impressive. So we'll try 2 layers of this, the thicker felt. So it hit on the double layer there, and no penetration. I mean, there's a tiny little pinprick of a hole there, but that would not have gone through. Very, very, very impressive performance. Well, we got a penetration at 65 degrees, but man, that is really impressive. And using that particular blade, that would certainly not have been a life-threatening injury. It might not have even been anything really significant more than just a little cut. Very, 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 very impressive for a fabric, essentially.
What you may not be able to see from the footage was how the knife blade was actually flexing under the impact at 55 and 65 degree pendulum angles at the point of impact. I could see that because I was standing directly behind it. but since the camera was placed to the side, you probably wouldn't have been able to see it. There was some serious energy and force behind those attacks. And the results were actually quite remarkable. A little bit too remarkable, I felt. So the scientist in me was not convinced, and I was a little bit skeptical. I was a little concerned that there were a couple of factors that could have contributed to overperformance of the ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene felt. Firstly, I noticed that the GI Tanto blade point had a very tiny burr right on the tip, which could have been catching on the fabric and thus skewing the test results. Secondly, the foam backing pad was very beaten up from previous tests, and there were a lot of penetration points in it, which could have been allowing more room for the fabric to gather around the knife blade and artificially improve its apparent performance. So I took some very fine sandpaper and I removed the burr on the very tip of the blade, and then I sharpened the Tanto point until it was paper shaving sharp all the way up to the very tip. So essentially made it as penetrative as I could. In addition, I replaced the foam pad with a new one. I then repeated the tests using only a single layer of felt. These tests were far less successful, showing that these kinds of tests can be very dependent on test and equipment conditions. However, the felt was still able to prevent penetration at a 25-degree pendulum angle. I then tested 2 layers of felt, and this is what the tests looked like.
Didn't penetrate all the way through. Probably only a few millimeters of penetration, or centimeter or two. So that was a more significant penetration. That would have probably penetrated fully, although that was at 55 degrees. Let's try it again at 35. So I got a little bit too close to the other penetration point there, but that's at 35. As you can see, it's pretty much stopped. Might have been a couple of millimeters penetration in this case. So that's at 45, that's at 55, and that's at 35.
Now, although the material started failing substantially at an angle of approximately 45 degrees, the failure was not catastrophic and could possibly represent a series of survivable attacks. Despite the fact that the fabric, this fabric is not fully stab proof, I have to say that it appears to have outperformed all the other fabrics that I've tested on my channel. In order to demonstrate this, I did an informal stab test using a scalpel, comparing this felt's performance to a woven aramid cloth and woven ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene cloth. And this is what that looked like. So I thought that I would illustrate, or at least test this ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene felt's performance in relation to some other materials that I have tested in the past in terms of cut and stab resistance. So I've got three different samples here. I've got the ultra high molecular weight polyethylene felt. I've got some ultra high molecular weight polyethylene fabric, just a weave, which is often sold as cut resistant clothing. And I've got a pad of Kevlar, ballistic Kevlar. There are about 8 layers in this pad, so nowhere near as many layers as you get in a typical ballistic, soft ballistic body armor, but it'll potentially be a good indicator of its cut and stab resistance. I'm going to use some safety gloves, and I'm going to use a face shield when I'm doing these tests, just in case anything goes wrong. And I'm going to perform the tests with a scalpel. I've got this, the samples are going to be mounted on this, or not mounted, but just placed on this foam pad, just to give some give behind it, as it might be when worn on a human torso. So we'll start with the Kevlar. Just going to stab down, and yeah, so it goes straight through the sample without any problem, cutting straight through 8 layers of ballistic Kevlar, and that illustrates the problem with most ballistic, soft ballistic body armor systems when it comes to stab and cut resistance. Often, even with the greater number of layers in a typical ballistic vest, knives can actually still penetrate and do serious damage. So we'll try the ultra high molecular weight polyethylene fabric, and again the scalpel goes straight through without a problem. So although it may be cut resistant, so if I try cutting it, you can see that it's quite cut resistant, at least for like low energy cutting, but in terms of stab resistance it doesn't offer you much protection. So now we'll go for the ultra high molecular weight polyethylene felt. I'm just going to stab down. So small amount of penetration, but the scalpel didn't go all the way through. Again, tiny amount of penetration, but the scalpel didn't actually penetrate fully. Oh, and there's the scalpel blade. It just goes to show
how effective this material is compared to other materials that are occasionally used or sold as cut-resistant materials. In terms of stabbing, both of the other samples failed quite badly. This had minimal penetration on the tests that I've done in the center here, and actually ended up snapping the scalpel blade on the last test. So a very, very different type of material. Now, the reason I did this test is not particularly scientific. It's more just as a demonstration. But the reason I did it was because although I've tested the material more scientifically using a pendulum-based swinging arm with an attached knife blade and weighted as well. Although that's a lot more scientific, perhaps for some people that holds a lot less credence than a demonstration where you actually see a scalpel blade snap as it tries to penetrate this material. So remarkable stab resistance. It's not perfect. Of course you can. Ultimately you will be able to get through with something depending on the amount of energy behind the strike and the type of weapon used, but far more substantial stab resistance than any of the other contenders.
So I believe that there is a lot of potential for this material if it is modified in some way, perhaps through the addition of some articulated rigid elements, perhaps treating it with various types of adhesives in different types of ways, or as simply as bonding 3 or 4 layers into a pad. Because even 4 layers of this fabric, remembering that this fabric is 2 millimeters thick, the 4 layers of this fabric should be anywhere between 8 and 10 millimeters in thickness, so perhaps 1 centimeter thick. It may still be thinner, lighter, and more resistant to stabbing and less restrictive than a typical conventional padded gambeson. I believe that it is a worthwhile material to experiment with, and I intend to do so in my spare time. I'll see what comes out of those tests. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all again next time. Cheers.